Oops, hold on. There we go. Okay. So most people are probably familiar with the museum fire, but for those who aren't, I'll give a brief overview. So the museum fire ignited on July 21st in 2019, just north of the Flagstaff city limits. And today we'll be taking a look at the fire through a geologist's eyes. And specifically, some things that we're concerned about as geologists are that the fire burned on very steep slopes. And in particular, a lot of those slopes burned at high and moderate burn severity. So that increases our risk for erosion and runoff, and specifically floods and debris flows, which may then impact the public and infrastructure. So what makes this relatively small fire dangerous, especially considering that we've had so many mega fires in the West? Why is this relatively small one so important? And it is important because it drains directly into Flagstaff neighborhoods and businesses. And also because Eldon Lookout Road, which is the only road that leads to critical communication towers that serve the greater Flagstaff area, goes right through the burn scar. And in many places, this road is like strapped onto the side of a very, very steep hill slope. And so when you introduce post-fire flooding to that, your road becomes more susceptible to floods and debris flows. So some of the initial work that was done to help mitigate the effects of floods and debris flows in the burn scar were the installation of articulating concrete block mats, which are pictured up here in the right. And the installation of cable barriers and riprap. And so these were placed where there were stream crossings, normally dry stream crossings that went across the road. And so these were designed to help prevent the road from washing out. And additionally, helicopter aerial mulching was done where mulch was dropped onto sections of the burn scar, not the whole thing, but just some localized spots to help protect the soil and decrease it from eroding away. Then lower on the floodplain, cross vein weirs, which are pictured in the bottom right, were in place to help slow down the flow as it entered into town, right above town. Culverts were upgraded from smaller sized ones to double culverts. And then within town, Jersey barriers and sandbags were placed around homes and businesses to protect them from floodwaters, and stream bollards were put into the channel to help protect the culverts from any large debris entering them and clogging them. So the big question remains as to how will the burn scar recover over time. So that's where our work in geomorphic monitoring comes in. And specifically for the museum fire, we chose 3 different study basins, 2 on the west side of the burn scar, and these were not treated with any mulch. And then 1 on the east side, which was treated with mulch. So some of our specific monitoring goals were to, 1, understand the present flooding hazard and how that hazard is going to evolve over time. And then also to document post-fire debris flow initiation conditions, to monitor channel impacts from debris flows within the burn scar, to determine the effectiveness of the aerial mulching treatments at minimizing erosion, and lastly, to document any damage to road treatments. So how did we do this? So we employed a couple different methods, the first being looking at the soil hydrology evolution. So essentially how the soils are recovering over time. And we used a mini disc infiltrometer to do that, which is pictured in the bottom left. And we also conducted ground cover change surveys. So looking at, okay, what's happening over time with vegetation? Are we seeing an increase, a decrease? What type of vegetation in terms of like, is it trees coming back or annual vegetation? Is there an increase in mineral soil exposed? Things like that. And then we also looked at hill slope rilling, channel incision, and channel headward migration, all of which are indicators of significant erosion on the landscape through runoff. So things that would increase your risk for debris flows and floods. And lastly, we employed seismic monitoring to essentially determine exactly when, down to the second, debris flows are occurring in different basins on the burn scar. And this helps us get at what are the initiation conditions in terms of how much rainfall does it take to initiate a debris flow during these storms. So let's look at some of the flood and debris flow responses that we saw. And we'll start with the 2019 monsoon. So again, this was the year of the fire. And at the time, this was the driest monsoon in Flagstaff recorded history. And there were only 2 debris flow events that we know of. The first occurred before we had any monitoring equipment out because there were still sections of the fire that were considered active. So we weren't yet able to get any seismometers out or anything. But the second one occurred on August 28th, and we did have seismometers in the area. And we were able to pick up on the seismic energy created from these debris flow events. And if you look at the top graph, you can see a giant explosion in energy, and that's essentially the debris flow coming through. And this is the channel that debris flow came down. So you can see where it scoured out this swale to form a true channel. And on the left-hand side, this is a downstream view, and we can see where the trees have been debarked from rocks and logs and all sorts of debris hitting them as the flow moves down slope. And for those who are familiar with the area, this is near the Upper Oldham Trail. So that was it for 2019. Moving on to 2020, just when we thought it couldn't get any drier, this monsoon season took the prize as the #1 driest monsoon in Flagstaff history. And subsequently, we only had one notable storm this season, and that occurred on July 24th. Specifically, this storm had a peak 15-minute rainfall intensity of 51 millimeters per hour. And to put that into perspective, this storm had a recurrence interval of 1 to 2 years. So it's a pretty common type of storm that we would see for the area. And it initiated small magnitude debris flows in the burn scar, which we captured their energy from our seismometer, and as we can see in the upper right corner. And this resulted in some road damage that was relatively minimal. The picture makes it look a little worse than it actually is, but as you'll soon see, this is relatively minor damage. So moving on to the 2021 monsoon, which was really cool from a geomorph perspective. So we had multiple events this year. And the first of them was on July 13th. And this event had a peak 15-minute intensity of 110 millimeters per hour, which is a 25-year event. So it was pretty significant. And as you would expect, it initiated a lot of debris flows in the burn scar, caused moderate damage to Eldon Lookout Road. In the bottom left corner, we can see where the flow has come in from the right and deposited a bunch of boulders onto Eldon Lookout Road. And also this event caused some flooding in town too. And then the very next day, there was another event, but this event was only a 40 millimeter per hour event. So significantly less intense rainfall than the previous day, but it still caused quite a bit of damage. The photo in the bottom left corner shows that same area as the previous slide with Eldon Lookout Road and the flow coming in from the right-hand side. And you can see again, it deposited boulders and even a tree this time And up higher in the watershed, it caused some damage to those articulating concrete block mats and cable barriers as well. And then 2 days after that, there was another event. And this one was really interesting because it actually had 2 peaks in rainfall that were separated by about 20 minutes. We can see that in our rainfall plot in the bottom right-hand corner. And that's also reflected in the seismic response that we saw where we had 2 peaks in debris flow activity. And to give you an idea of what these things look like when they're coming down, on the left-hand side, there's photos of the debris flow moving across Eldon Lookout Road, both at the peak of the flow and then after the flow. So it caused quite a bit of scour damage to the road there. But still, none of these compare to the largest event of the summer, which occurred on August 17th with a peak 15-minute intensity of 124 millimeters per hour, which is a 25 to 50 year event. So that's pretty cool in terms of geomorphology, not so much in terms of what it does downstream in the community. And this caused widespread debris flows and again, downstream flooding. And one of the debris flows that we were able to actually measure the deposit of, I have on the left-hand side, and my field partner is circled in yellow for scale. So this was the largest deposit that we were able to map from that debris flow activity, and it had a volume of 3,000 cubic meters. That's a ton of material coming down these channels and onto the floodplain. And I have a video of that deposit moving down the channel before it deposited on the floodplain. So we want to look right here and see that debris flow come through, and I'll play it one more time. Oh, it's going to make me loop through it. Hold on. Okay, so one more time and look kind of towards the center. You can see these trees go bye-bye. So pretty big events moving down these relatively small, unassuming channels. And as you would expect, this caused quite a bit of significant road damage to Eldon Lookout Road. You can see here, these culverts have been completely infilled with sediment. And on the right-hand side, one of those concrete block mats was undercut from the flows moving downstream and then scouring out this hole here. So that's created a dangerous situation where now the structure is undercut on the left side. So what change did we see at our headwater monitoring sites in 2021? So in terms of soil hydrology, we're looking at hydraulic conductivity, which is one of the soil hydrology factors that we use to analyze how soils are recovering over time. We're just going to focus on the hydraulic conductivity, which I'll refer to as KSAT. So we saw a really interesting pattern where in the spring seasons, we would see a pretty good increase in KSAT, which is good in terms of recovery. But then in the fall, we would see a decrease, which is not so great. And overall, we've been going towards recovery, which is represented by these unburned values on the far right. And we've definitely improved from the hydrophobic conditions that we saw in the very first monitoring season. And an example of that is pictured on the left, where we have essentially zero infiltration. The water's just sitting on the surface, very bad. But it's very interesting that we're seeing those decreases in fall. And we have a couple ideas as to why that's happening. So we think that the increase in spring is probably caused through freeze-thaw of the soils in winter, which essentially breaks up that hydrophobic layer in the soil and provides cracks for the water to infiltrate. And then during the summer, those cracks and little pore spaces get infilled from things like rain splash, overland flow, and wind, which are bringing in those fine particles to fill in those cracks. So those are our leading ideas so far as to why we're seeing this pattern. And for our ground cover surveys, in our treated basin, which has the mulch, we saw a significant increase in trees, which were aspen in this case, and also in annual vegetation, which that makes sense since we actually had rainfall in 2021 for these plants to grow. And then in our untreated sites, we saw an increase in annual vegetation. We didn't see any aspen, but this site in particular didn't have aspen to begin with, so kind of makes sense that we're not seeing that coming back post-fire either. Next, moving on to hill slope rilling, there were quite a few rills that popped up after the 2021 monsoon. And essentially these are formed when you have overland flow coming down your hill slope, and it coalesces and forms essentially these mini channels that go down the hill slope and then form gullies and then go into the channels. So in 2020, we saw a decrease in rilling, and this is likely due to the fact that we didn't have really any rainstorms to perpetuate the rills in the first place. There's actually quite a bit of bioturbation at our monitoring sites as well. So those little critters burrowing and stomping around on the landscape, helping to fill in those rill spaces. But then in 2021, we saw a sharp increase in rilling following the 2021 monsoon. And this makes sense because we had a lot of significant runoff. And lastly, at our channel monitoring sites, we saw head cutting and incision at nearly all of our study channels in the treated and untreated basins. So we saw an increase in gullying, which we can see here. And some sites had more deepening of the deepest part of the channel, which we refer to as the fall wag. Others didn't really have that much deepening. But overall, we saw erosion in our channels. And here's an example of what that looks like with the before monsoon photo on the left and the after monsoon photo on the right. The yellow circles depict the same areas. You can kind of train your eye to it. And in the after photos, you can see a lot of that mulch and upper layer of soil has been removed. So everything that happened in 2021 prompted additional action to reduce the flows and sediment entering the community. So this is where the Museum Fire Sediment Reduction Project comes in, where alluvial fans were modified on the floodplain below the burn scar, but upstream of the city. And the idea with these was they wanted to create an accommodation space for these flows coming down. So prior to treating these areas, the flow was channelized, even on the fans. So we can see this channel coming down here. Whereas after the treatment, these fan areas got bladed. A lot of the vegetation got removed, sadly, except for this one lone tree. And the idea with these is now that the surface is completely graded, your flow can spread out, and encourage sediment to drop out and water to infiltrate, rather than it just shooting down the fan in a channelized fashion. And these were constructed by Natural Channel Design based in Flagstaff. So to give an idea of what these kind of look like and how they function, this is looking upstream on one of these mitigation structures, and perpendicular to flow, they have log sills and boulder sills to try to help prevent scouring and erosion of these mitigation surfaces. And then at the upstream and downstream sides, you have rock chutes and trenches, which help to slow the flow down prior to it entering the structure and leaving the structure. So where do we come in all of this? So our goal was we wanted to monitor these mitigation structures, which are highlighted in the yellow box, and analyze how they perform during the 2022 monsoon, but within context to the headwater recovery. So our headwater monitoring sites, which I've starred these yellow stars. And we wanted to answer two questions. We'll focus on one of them today. So we wanted to know, do these mitigation structures promote sediment deposition and infiltration? But today we're just going to focus on the sediment deposition component. So we have 3 study sites, mitigation study sites, and these are in addition to our headwater sites. So we have the western tributary, the 40-acre parcel, and the control tributary. So our control site had nothing done to it. There was no mitigation, it was left alone. Whereas the western tributary and 40-acre site, those were the ones that got graded. And one important thing that I want to note here is that the flow from our mitigated and control tributary does not interact with the flow that's coming from the east side of the burn scar, because they're in 2 separate channels that later come together, but for the region we're interested in, they're separate. So very quick overview of what these sites look like. Again, the control tributary had no treatments applied to it, so it remains a very narrow and incised channel, and it has a pretty steep grade of 16%, which is kind of similar to the western tributary, which we're comparing it to in our study, which has a grade of 12%, but this one was graded, and we can see what it looked like before on the right-hand side and then after. And lastly, we have our 40-acre parcel. So this site is really neat and cool because it has a lower gradient than the western tributary. And that gradient's only about 4 to 6%. But we can see that prior to being treated, the flow was still fairly channelized on the floodplain versus afterwards. It's this nice wide swath. Very quick overview of some of the methods we use to study these structures. We use gain cameras to look at different flow characteristics, is the flow spreading out when it enters these? Is it converging? Is it scouring? We also conducted pebble counts to look at what size of sediment is dropping out or being scoured away. And we also conducted cross sections to look at areas of deposition and scouring. And we employed some sediment samplers, but we won't get into that today. All right, so what happened in the 2022 monsoon? So the first event we had this summer was on July 15th, and this event had no impact to the mitigation structure side of the burn, because this focused on the east side of the burn scar. So these flows came down that separate channel that I had mentioned. And this event had a peak 15-minute intensity of 74 millimeters per hour. And when we compare that to the 2021 events, which had a 64 millimeter per hour rainfall intensity, we can see that the 2022 event stayed inside of its channel, whereas in 2021, it was just kind of everywhere wreaking havoc. So that's a really interesting observation, because we can see that the basin response is kind of starting to decrease. over time. And here we have a debris flow coming down that same channel that I showed a video from earlier. So we're still seeing things happen in the burn scar, but its effect is starting to not be so apparent moving downstream. And moving on to our second event of the summer, which was on July 29th, this one occurred on the west side, so it did impact the mitigation structures. This event had a peak intensity of 88 millimeters per hour, which is a 5 to 10 year event. So, you know, nothing super crazy, but it's also not that common. And we can see in the animation down here that the flow spreads out on the mitigation structure, but it does later converge back into a channel below the structure and remains confined, which is good. That's what we want. And then on the right-hand side is just what that flow looks like above the animation. So specifically going site to site, at our control tributary, during this event, we saw relatively minor flow. That's pictured on the right-hand side right before the flow and then during the peak flow. So nothing super crazy going on here. There was a negligible change in the sediment size, and we saw pretty minor deposition on the lowest part of the fan, only 5 centimeters of deposition. So, I mean, nothing crazy is going on in the control tributary. Whereas at the western tributary, we saw shallow scouring on the mitigation structure, and that's what I have pictured here, where my field partner has her boot up on the relatively unaffected surface, and the other boot down where it got scoured out. So there's about a foot of scouring there. And initially the flow spread out onto the surface when it entered it, but then refocused onto the river left side, looking downstream, the left side of the structure on the downstream end. And this is most likely due to the structure having such a steep grade that it's easier for flow to converge when you're on a steeper slope. And then looking at the 40-acre site, this is the location that is has a much gradualer grade. And we saw the flow spread across the entire mitigation surface and deposit mud and sand. So starting on the left-hand side, we have prior to the flow, during the peak flow, and then the aftermath. And you can see that it's quite a muddy hit. And moving on to the third event of the summer, which happened on August 7th, this event only had a peak intensity of 46 millimeters per hour, and therefore it had a pretty minimal flood response and minimal change at our monitoring locations. So on the bottom left, there's an animation of the flow coming onto the fan. It's nothing really to write home about. And on the right-hand side, we have our 40-acre site prior to and then during the peak flow. Again, nothing to write home about. It's not even able to move these mulch piles here, so nothing crazy. So overall, during the 2022 monsoon, at our control tributary, we saw negligible change during both events. The flow remained channelized during both events, and we didn't really see a change in our sediment distribution, which we can see in our particle chart down here. Nothing really changed. But at the western tributary, we saw an increase in coarse sediment and a decrease in fine sediment like sand and mud, things like that. We can see that in our distribution chart, where the green and orange lines represent our two events. And there's a decrease in the finer sediment fraction. And this is likely related to the fact that, again, this is a steep slope. It has higher stream power and it's able to move those finer that finer sediment downstream. And then at our 40-acre site, we saw an increase in fine sediment. So where did that probably come from? The western tributary, because this is directly downstream of it. If it was removed from one spot and it's showing up here, it probably came from the western trib. And that just shows that this site, since it has a more gradual slope, it's better at promoting sediment dropout. But also with that dropout, we had mud infill the chutes and trenches on the upstream and downstream sides of this basin. So that was kind of cool to see, but also troublesome, which we will get to later. So let's put this all into context with what's happening in the headwaters during the 2022 season. So with our soil hydrology, we're seeing that continued pattern of an increase in KSAT in the spring and a decrease in fall. But the thing I want to point out here is that in spring 2022, right before the monsoon, there was a huge increase in KSAT, which is good for soil recovery. So maybe that helps explain why we didn't see the same types of responses with similar rainfall events when you're comparing 2021 to 2022, because our soil is in recovery and able to absorb more water than the previous year. And then looking at our ground cover surveys, kind of following a similar trend, we keep seeing an increase in vegetation, which is great for protecting the soil, creating surface roughness, which then can slow down your flows as they're coming down the hill slope. And they also provide soil root strength to decrease the amount of soil erosion. And then looking at rills, we're seeing a decrease in rills, and that makes sense because we're not seeing as much of a response from our basins. And lastly, our channels. We saw a negligible change at our untreated sites, which we have pictured down here. So there's nothing that changes in the channel between fall 2021 and fall 2022. But unfortunately, we weren't able to get out to our treated sites this fall due to bad weather. So conclusions from this, from all this. One is that our soils are recovering over time, but they're showing that really interesting pattern of a decrease in the fall and an increase in the spring. And this is something that we're going to be looking into more with our other fire monitoring sites, because this is a very significant pattern that we're seeing. Next is that we've seen a significant increase in vegetation and trees, which is important for protecting that soil and helping the overall recovery. Next is when comparing similar intensity storms, the watershed response is decreasing over time. So in 2021, we saw crazy responses coming out of the watershed, whereas those responses are decreasing in 2022. And with that, we also saw fewer intense rainfall events this summer, and therefore less opportunities to test the floodplain mitigation structure efficacy. Next, fine sediment was removed from the western tributary. Makes sense, it's steep, and deposited onto the 40-acre gradual mitigation structure. And lastly, our mitigation structures have likely not experienced the same flow magnitude that we've seen in 2021, which brings me to future considerations where we need to test the efficacy of these structures below younger burn scars, where we have a higher probability of encountering more intense flows to see if they actually work. And a place where we can possibly do this, there's things kind of in the works, is below the pipeline burn scar. And for that, I'll take questions.
Great. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, Rebecca. So to kick us off, Eric was wondering how much these mitigation projects cost.
I cannot remember off the top of my head. Oh, I cannot remember. They're not cheap. I can tell you that. But I cannot remember the specific number.
Okay. If you know of any resources where we can find that answer, we can share that out afterwards as well.
Yes.
So Ed was wondering if you are expanding monitoring to the pipeline burn scar, which I know you just mentioned. In particular, Ed is wondering about the Wupati trails and government tank.
Yeah, so we are kind of in the works with getting funding to do that. But as long as everything goes well, we'll be out there this summer monitoring those if the funding comes through.
Great. I'm going to bring us back to the question of these mitigation projects really quickly. And it might just be me who doesn't have the timeline straight in my head, but you mentioned a number of different mitigation measures, so stream crossing weirs, culvert improvements, Jersey barriers, slope seeding. But we also know that downstream communities still experienced significant flooding and debris flow impacts in 2021. So can you clarify when those mitigation measures were put in place?
Yeah, those were put in place prior to the 2022 monsoon. So during the winter of 2021, after the 2021 flows, they were in response to those.
Okay, so then a follow-up question. I thought that was the case. You know, in the Southwest, I think that we generally recognize this monsoonal pattern and people try to work pretty quickly to put mitigation measures in place immediately following a fire before the monsoon that usually comes right after. So with this fire, it's sort of unusual because we had 2 years of sort of this grace period. And I know that there was some risk modeling and spatial analysis that was done immediately following the fire. So do you know why those mitigation activities did not happen prior to the 2021 flooding? Was it, you know, we didn't have the funds available? Were these specific impacts unanticipated? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, I've kind of wondered the same thing. You know, we kind of had a nice grace period of, you know, 2 years to get things done, but I don't know if it was a funding issue or a permitting issue. That would be something that natural channel design would have a better answer to than myself.
Okay, I appreciate you answering. I just figured I'd throw it out there.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, so Jerry was wondering, do you think that the rainfall measurements are representative for each of your studied watersheds?
Let's see. I guess I'm not really sure how to answer that question. Like, I guess, do I think that the rainfall intensities are representative?
And Jerry, feel free to correct me if I'm not taking this the right way. I think they're asking, do you think that those rainfall measurements were consistent across the landscape at each of your study sites?
Oh, no, the rainfall is highly variable. So let's see, going back to what we saw in 2022 this year, with the very first event of the year, that was focused on the eastern side of the burn scar, and the western side was like unaffected. I think I have the number right here. Yeah, so the west side had like hardly any rain during that event, but then the eastern side was just hammered. And that's something that we have seen over the entire monitoring period. Is there's some sections of the burn scar that will have lots of rain, whereas just a mile away, they have hardly anything. Yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Okay, and Jerry, if it doesn't, please follow up in the chat with any additional questions you have. I will just drop a note in that Neil Chapman, thank you so much, said to contact Coconino County FCD for cost details and dropped a link in the chat.
Awesome, thank you.
So Derek was wondering, fine sediment was removed from the steep west tributary and then deposited at the shallow sloped 40 acre. This would also be expected if no mitigation treatments were implemented. Do you think that an appreciable amount of the erosion and deposition was in fact due to the mitigation structures versus antecedent long profiles of the watershed? And then a follow-up question, how do we evaluate if it's worth it to do the earthwork?
Yeah, so that's something that we're hoping to answer with the potential pipeline structure study, because it's a little hard to tell whether, you know, they were effective because we're so far out from, you know, the initial fire year. And with studying a younger fire, you have more potential for bigger events and more frequent events, maybe, I don't know. So the idea with looking at the pipeline ones is, you know, maybe we'd be able to have bigger events that we could really look at and be like, okay, what happened here? Did it just blow through the mitigation structure? Did it deposit on top of it? Meaning that, you know, maybe it did something. But yeah, these things have not been really studied much. This work that we did this past year was the first real look into how they function. And we only had really kind of one event to really look at them. So that's why we need more research on these with future fires to see if they really do anything.
Okay, so speaking of future research, Shirley Picosa, and Shirley, it's great to see you on here today. Thanks for joining. Was wondering if you have collaborated or would think about collaborating with tribes to participate in these projects, considering the cultural significance of the San Francisco Peaks.
Yeah, I'd definitely be interested in that. I don't know if I could go through the Forest Service to do that, or I'm not sure, but yeah, be interested in that. Especially, you know, if culturally significant sites are being, you know, impacted by these structures, or, you know, if they're close to a debris flow channel and they could potentially be, you know, damaged through that. Yeah.
Alrighty, Jerry popped another question in the chat. I'm wondering if you could benefit from more gauges.
For more gauges?
Yeah. More
the more the merrier. And actually at the museum, we have, gosh, there's there's 3 headwaters gauges for, and like considering the size of the watershed, you know, it's fairly small. That's a pretty good density of rainfall gauges for the headwaters, but yeah, the more the merrier always.
Okay, and Jerry did just say that that was to try to clarify their first question, but I appreciate answering it. So I know that you mentioned that a lot of these areas, especially the areas that were mulched, have seen some pretty good flora regeneration. But Bruce was wondering, are there plans to revegetate the mitigated areas? And if so, when and with what?
Oh, like the mitigation structures? They did put some seed down and they put mulch on top of that. But I have found, especially on that steep fan, that the surface was pretty hard, like physically hard. And I mean, I did see some, you know, grasses. I'm not a plant specialist by any means. But I did see some grasses coming up on that. But I mean, monsoon season immediately followed that seeding project. So how much of that was just washed downstream? I'm not totally sure. So I don't know if they're going to revegetate this winter at all. I'm not sure. Or early spring, I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. Ethan was wondering if you've been able to correlate the increase in soil conductivity in spring 2022 with any of your data. They're wondering what factors may have contributed to the large increase in veg cover that you saw.
Yeah, so I think the large increase in vegetation cover and also in the conductivity, they're related. So in 2021, we had rainfall, unlike in 2019 and 2020, which were just, it was like a dust bowl out there. But in 2021, we had all that rainfall, which was able to help these plants germinate and grow. And I think that combined with the freeze thaw action gave us that big spike in conductivity.
Alrighty. So another question from Dave. You mentioned that surface runoff removed wood shred mulch from treated sites. Roughly, what was the rainfall intensity that resulted in the loss of mulch? And a second question, did slope or any other factors influence the effectiveness of the mulch? And I know you sort of just touched on this.
Yeah, so the basin that had the mulch in it, it's a pretty steep one. And I wasn't able to go to the site after each storm because they were back to back to back. It was the 13th, the 14th, the 16th. So it wasn't safe for us to get up into that basin. So I don't know the exact rainfall intensity that resulted in the removal. But I could go back and look at what was the greatest intensity for that part of the basin, which I think that one was in the 70s. I have to look.
Okay, and then if you want to just touch on the second part of that question, do you know if slope or any other factors influenced the loss of mulch and sort of that surface runoff and depository?
Yeah, I'm sure the slope contributed a lot to the loss because it's so steep. It has a lot of potential for movement. So as soon as those rills start coming down the hill slope and with all the overland flow, that's going to easily carry those wood shreds downstream. It's so steep.
Okay, and then Kara just asked a question following up on Dave's. One of the initial study questions that you presented was focused toward mulching effectiveness in mitigating debris flows. Did this study provide evidence that mulching was effective to prevent debris flows?
Yeah, so interestingly, I don't think we were able to make that conclusion because we had 2 years between, well, 2 seasons between the mulching and the rainfall. So in that time, you have decomposition of the wood shreds. There were quite a few high wind events, and that wind was able to blow some of those around and off that side. So I don't really think that we can make a conclusion on that. And we saw a steady decrease in mulch from each season. So yeah, I don't really think we can make the conclusion just because it has such a unique post-fire history with that 2-year dry window immediately following the fire.
All right, I might be coming at you with one more question that you're not sure of the answer. That also has to do with mulch, but I know you didn't really touch on this part of it in your presentation, your observations of infiltration response to treatments, but I am curious to hear if the mulch treatments or the blading prevented any of that summer infilling of perforated hydrophobic soils that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation. or what you guys are saying is the likely cause of the breakup of the hydrophobic soils and then infilling during the summer.
Yeah, so the blading only occurred down on the floodplain, not up in the headwaters. So the only treatment on the hill slopes was the mulching. Let's see, and you were wondering if the mulching had any impact on the hydraulic conductivity?
Mm-hmm.
I don't really think it did. I'd have to take a closer look, but I don't think it did. Because we saw similar values in KSAP between the untreated and treated sides.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then, oh, let's see, Shirley did put a contact in the chat for the Southwest Youth Conservation Corps who might be able to help with groundwork, and mentioned that she knows that the Hopi tribe also worked with natural channel design on spring restorations to mitigate non-point source pollution. So that might be an avenue moving forward.
Yeah, I'm always looking for help, especially field help.
I'm gonna shoot one more question your way, and for anyone else, if you have any last minute questions for Rebecca, please put them in the chat and we'll get those over. So this is sort of the obligatory question. Anytime you bring research in here, you know, what are the management implications? Given that we did see such severe post-fire impacts in this area that was, you know, a relatively small fire with only 17% high burn severity and this sort of unusual monsoonal patterns, what lessons learned do you think we can pull for future post-fire flood planning?
Yeah, I think getting mitigation on the ground as soon as possible. I mean, yes, there were things done that were not cheap, like all the road treatments to Eldon Lookout Road, not cheap at all. And I do really believe that they, like those concrete block mats, those types of things, I think that saved the road. I think it would have been completely gone in that 2021 monsoon. But I think putting in mitigation on the floodplain as soon as possible, you know, especially when there's such high risk to the community downstream, I think that's really important. And I think over the next couple of years, you know, we'll see, you know, are these mitigation structures efficient, or should we just go with the tried and true like detention basins, which, I mean, nobody really wants to look at a detention basin, but it may be a longer term solution for communities living, you know, downstream of a highly susceptible region.
Yeah, Shala just put in the comments that perhaps we should also consider offsite planning to get infrastructure out of drainages downstream and allow channels to function on and off public lands. So returning to natural functioning is always one of those restoration and treatments that we should be prioritizing.
Right. It's it's very difficult when the floodplain is developed, you know, because a channel will naturally change its outlet point, you know, over time. But as humans, we want the channel to stay where it is so we can, you know, build upon the floodplain, but the channel has other plans.
All right. Well, Rebecca, I really look forward to seeing where this research leads over the next couple of years, and you know what conclusions come out of it. And we'll be happy to stay in contact with you in the future. So thank you so much for coming on today and giving your excellent presentation and giving us the time. And thank you everybody for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining. Yeah.
All right. Have a wonderful day.
Okay. Bye.